While the English Civil War of the 1600s is famously remembered as a time when different political factions were set against each other in conflict, this wasn't the first time that the country of England had seen its people fight against their neighbours in open warfare, a notable example of this being the Anarchy of the 12th century. The Anarchy arose from a succession crisis between the heir apparent, the Empress Maud, and her cousin, Stephen of Blois, with both leaders rallying nobles and their armies together in vicious bloodshed across the country that would last for nearly 20 years. The seeds of the Anarchy were sown with the Norman conquest of 1066, during which, at the famous Battle of Hastings, William, Duke of Normandy, successfully defeated the Saxon English king Harold Godwinson and took the crown of England as William I. Eventually, Norman influence took control of most of England and large parts of South Wales by the time of his death in 1087. In the wake of his passing, the division and control of England, which was essentially a Norman colony, proved difficult to manage. William's sons, Richard Curthose, William Rufus, and Henry Beauclerc, engaged in often brutal sporadic wars to seize the most valuable assets. Initially, following Norman tradition, Richard became Duke of Normandy, the principal estate, while William became King William II of England, as this was deemed the second estate. However, during a hunt in the New Forest, a stray arrow ended William's life, Henry Beauclerc hurrying to Winchester to claim the vacant throne, becoming King Henry I of England. Subsequently, Henry invaded and captured the Duchy of Normandy, defeating Duke Robert's army at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1107. This therefore made Henry the undisputed Lord of England and Normandy, intending for his only legitimate son, the 17-year-old William Adelin, to inherit these lands upon his death. However, disaster struck on November 25, 1120, when during a violent storm in the English Channel, the White Ship, en route from Barfleur to England, struck a rock shortly after departing and sank, with nearly all 300 aboard drowning, including William Adelin. The death of Adelin aboard the White Ship was a devastating blow to Henry, and immediately threw the line of succession into doubt, the general rule in France being that only the eldest son could inherit absolutely. However, in Normandy and England, the tradition was for lands to be divided, as was the case upon the death of King William I. In the 20 years of his rule, Henry, by various means, had ensured that he was now undisputed ruler of two equally important territories, and thus had no intention of this budding empire to be torn apart, and desired that any successor would inherit his territory as a single entity. Unfortunately, Henry's only other legitimate child, now by royal decree the heir apparent, was his daughter Matilda, the potential of a woman becoming successor to the throne, creating turmoil, and put Henry at odds with the traditional rules of succession. Thus, some of the nobles sought to undermine any possibility of Matilda acceding to the throne, even calling into question the legitimacy of Henry's own rule. By 1125, Henry's reign was becoming increasingly unpopular, fueled largely by exorbitant rises in taxation to fund his various military campaigns. This notwithstanding, though, he attempted to create strong political support for Matilda in both England and Normandy, and in 1127, 1128, and 1131 he demanded that an oath be taken to recognize Matilda as his immediate successor, and also recognize her descendants as the rightful ruler after her, one of those taking the oath being her cousin and Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. Matilda, who had taken the title of Empress Maud from her first husband, Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor, married Geoffrey V of Anjou in 1128, following her first husband's death, and shortly thereafter, relations between the couple and her father became strained, and thus cast doubt as to whether Maud had the genuine support of the English and Norman courts as demanded by Henry. In 1135, they suggested to Henry that the king should hand over the royal castles in Normandy to Maud while he was still alive, and insist on the Norman nobility swearing immediate allegiance to her, the couple feeling that this would give them a much more powerful position after Henry's death. Henry, however, refused the proposal, seeing it as a potential deception by Geoffrey to seize power in Normandy, and as a result, a rebellion broke out, with Geoffrey and Maud providing military support on behalf of the rebels. In the midst of this confrontation, the elderly King Henry suddenly fell ill and died near Lyons-la-Forêt on December 1, 1135, at the age of 67. With the news of Henry's death, Stephen of Blois, a powerful Norman count and a well-established figure in Anglo-Norman society, as well as being the second richest man in England behind the king, rushed across the Channel from his position in Boulogne and seized the crown. Meanwhile, Maud was awkwardly tied up in her rebel campaign against what were potentially her own future royal troops in Anjou. Unable to easily make it back to London to claim the throne, the pair did have the advantage, against other potential claimants, due to their own oath that they would not leave Normandy until the king had been buried. Geoffrey and Maud, therefore, took the confusion as an opportunity to march into southern Normandy and seize a number of key castles. For Stephen, upon his arrival in London, he allowed the crowds of the city to undertake the tradition of claiming the right to elect the King of England, and thus he was proclaimed the new monarch, King Stephen I, this being conducted in part due to a belief that he would grant the city new rights and privileges in return, the new king then rapidly consolidating his power among the nobility. Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, delivered the support of the church, while Roger, Bishop of Salisbury and Lord Chancellor, instructed the royal treasury to be handed over to the monarch. However, while Stephen and his brother continued to rally support among the English population, the matter of the oath taken during 1127 to support Maud's right to succeed King Henry I remained a potentially fatal millstone around his reign. Henry of Blois was able to convincingly argue that the late monarch had been wrong to place such an oath upon the Anglo-Norman nobility, the late king only insisting on such an oath to protect the stability of the kingdom, and, in light of the chaos that might now ensue, Stephen would be justified in ignoring it. Therefore, on December 26, 1135, Stephen was crowned King Stephen I, this coronation being conducted in the midst of various vying powers seeking their own claims to the throne. The Norman nobility, for example, gathered at Lenuurborg to discuss declaring Stephen's elder brother, Theobald, as king instead. Theobald gathered a large amount of momentum among the barons of Normandy, but once word reached him of Stephen's coronation, support rapidly ebbed away, the barons fearing the loss of their lands should they not pay homage to the new king. To ensure that his brother presented no further thorn in his side, Stephen compensated Theobald financially, presenting him with a huge sum of money that was added to his already substantial fortune, Theobald remaining in Blois, and declared his support for his younger brother's accession to the throne. Immediately, though, war was afoot in Stephen's kingdom, the death of King Henry I giving King David I of Scotland, brother of Henry's first queen and maternal uncle of Maud, the impetus to invade northern England, which resulted in the capture of Carlisle, Newcastle and other key strongholds. The border between England and Scotland was a disputed territory, with the Scottish kings laying a traditional claim to Cumberland and Northumbria. In the end, Stephen would meet David in Durham, and reached an agreement in which the Scottish king would return most of the territory he had taken, with the exception of Carlisle, in return for Stephen confirming the possession of David's son, Prince Henry, in England, including the earldom of Huntingdon. However, Stephen's compromise with the Scots invaders was very unpopular, and his perceived usurpation of the throne meant he was unable to secure all factions of the English court under his rule. The only way to gain the loyalty of those around him was to appoint certain strategic nobles to high-ranking positions in order to buy their fealty, all while his accession to the throne still hadn't been ratified by the papal authorities in Rome. Elsewhere, further military defeats and compromises further eroded his support, as was the case in January 1136, when a rebellion in Glamorgan in South Wales expelled the Anglo-Norman authorities from the region, while attempts to suppress the uprising were half-hearted at best, thus leading Stephen to simply abandon Wales during 1137 as he focused on more pressing matters within his own court. In England, 2 revolts were mounted in Devon and Cornwall by noblemen Baldwin de Redvers and Robert of Brampton, both rebellions being successfully defeated, though rather than having Baldwin executed upon his capture, he was simply exiled to Normandy, where he would become an increasingly vocal critic of the king. Normandy itself became a hotbed of revolts and uprisings, led primarily by Geoffrey of Anjou, who undertook a guerrilla campaign against the estates of rival barons in Normandy, Stephen initially leaving the matter to Walren de Beaumont, lieutenant of Normandy, and his brother Theobald. Eventually, the king travelled to Normandy in order to swear homage to Louis VI of France in exchange for Stephen's son Eustace being recognised as Duke of Normandy, while in Normandy itself, Stephen chose to retake the Argentan province along the Normandy and Anjou border that had been captured by Geoffrey at the end of 1135, following King Henry I's death. This campaign collapsed before it even began, when frictions emerged between the Flemish mercenary forces of William of Ypres and the local Norman barons, leading to an internal battle between the two sides of Stephen's own army. In the end, the Norman barons deserted the king, and Stephen was forced to abandon his proposed retaking of Argentan, instead offering a truce to Geoffrey by promising to pay him 2,000 marks a year in exchange for peace along the Norman borders. Therefore, by 1138, Stephen's early reign was viewed by those around him as being somewhat weak and built upon various compromises, and while he had been able to secure peace with the French king, as well as along the Normandy and Scottish borders, each of these had only been undertaken through expensive and disadvantageous agreements. Henry's considerable treasury having been emptied due to the cost of running Stephen's more lavish court and the need to raise and maintain his mercenary armies fighting in England and Normandy. With Stephen in a truly weakened position, the anarchy began during 1138, when Robert of Gloucester led a rebellion against the king. Robert, as an illegitimate son of Henry I and half-brother of the Empress Maud, was one of the most powerful Anglo-Norman barons, with estates in Normandy and the earldom of Gloucester within his domain. Kent and southwest England soon engaged in fierce civil unrest and open conflict, once Robert had renounced his fealty to Stephen and declared his support for Maud. While Maud had not been involved in any active military campaigns since 1135, the start of Robert's rebellion gave her and Geoffrey the incentive to restart hostilities against Normandy, followed shortly thereafter by David I of Scotland, resuming his own invasion campaign into northern England, capturing Stephen's territory as far south as Yorkshire. Faced with assaults and uprising from multiple fronts, Stephen prioritised suppressing the rebellion of Robert of Gloucester by directing troops to recapture the vital harbour town of Dover. Meanwhile, a number of knights were sent north to aid in the defence of northern England against the Scottish, which would ultimately lead to David's pivotal defeat at the Battle of the Standard near Harrogate in August 1138. However, while David's advance had been well and truly halted, Stephen's kingdom was still being torn apart by the vying factions, his next move being to launch a major thrust with his army west into Gloucestershire before leading a campaign against the Welsh Marches, capturing Hereford and Shrewsbury, and then moving south to retake Bath. The only major stronghold left to Robert's rebellion was the port city of Bristol, which was besieged by Stephen's army, the rebels in Bristol seeking to maintain control of the harbour for as long as possible, in the hope that Robert, who was positioned in Normandy, might be able to persuade the Empress Maud to invade England. With the eventual fall of Dover at the end of 1138, she was unable to fully commit her army to an invasion of England for the present, meaning Stephen could rebuild his force and fortify his position. Having successfully warded off an internal rebellion and an invasion from Scotland, Stephen's strategic victory during 1138 has been considered by historians as one of the most exceptional campaigns in military history, retaking his kingdom and putting his enemies to flight for the immediate period. Stephen, taking advantage of the lull in hostilities, signed a peace agreement with King David called the Treaty of Durham, which would effectively grant Northumbria and Cumbria to David and his son Henry in exchange for their fealty and future peace along the border. However, with much of Normandy in Maud's hands, by 1139 a full invasion of England appeared to be imminent, all while the Empress appealed to the papal authorities in Rome to put forward her legal claim to the English throne, though Pope Innocent II refused to reverse his earlier support for Stephen. Meanwhile, Stephen prepared for the inevitable attack by preparing fortifications and creating additional earldoms that were filled with men he considered to be loyal and capable military commanders. At the same time, in order to root out political opponents, a reshuffle of high-ranking members of the ruling classes was undertaken in order to ensure that only the most loyal were in charge of running the nation. Roger, Bishop of Salisbury, was seen as highly likely to potentially defect to the Empress's side, and in so doing take with him his nephews, Alexander and Nigel, the bishops of Lincoln and Ely respectively, while additionally, Roger's son, Roger Le Poer, was the Lord Chancellor, all of these men holding great power and influence over English rule. To preempt this, during a court session held in Oxford during June 1139, Stephen secretly orchestrated a fight between the men of Alan of Brittany and Roger's own forces, the outcome of which resulted in Stephen demanding Roger and the other bishops surrender all of their castles in England, which, in combination with the arrest of the bishops, removed any military threat from them, though on the downside, this move created something of a rift between himself and the senior clergy. In August 1140, the invasion by the Empress Maud finally began with an attack on Wareham in Dorset, the primary aim being to capture the harbour in order to provide a suitable beachhead, though after much vicious fighting, Stephen's highly prepared defenders and the presence of the nearby keep meant Baldwin de Redvers, commanding the attack force, was unable to gain a foothold and was forced back into the Channel. On September 30th, at the invitation of the Dowager Queen Adeliza, Robert of Gloucester and the Empress landed in Arundel with 140 knights, the Empress remaining at Arundel, while Robert marched to relieve the besieged rebels in Bristol. However, Stephen was rapid in his response, and was soon able to besiege the castle at Arundel with Maud trapped inside, bringing a halt to Robert's campaign and forcing the signing of a truce in which Maud would be allowed to leave the castle and rejoin Robert's army in Devon. The reasons as to why Stephen allowed his rival for the English throne to escape have often been disputed, with most historians believing it was done to avoid a costly assault on the near-impregnable keep at Arundel, because of his own chivalrous and notably generous nature, and perhaps because he considered his true enemy in the war was in fact Robert of Gloucester. Following her retreat into the southwest, the Empress now controlled a large swathe of western England that stretched from Devon and Cornwall to Bristol and up into the Welsh Marches, with its most eastern extents in Oxford and Wallingford directly threatening London, while her court was established in Gloucester and the bulk of her army was stationed in Bristol. Stephen, however, could not allow this region of his domain to remain under his cousin's control, thus he focused his initial campaign against Wallingford, as this guarded the Thames, though due to the keep being too well defended, Stephen instead moved into Wiltshire, taking the castles at South Cherney and Malmesbury before finally capturing Trowbridge. The proximity of the Empress's forces to London, though, was a major thorn in Stephen's side when it came to retaking the west of England, and thus, before he could proceed any further than Trowbridge, Miles of Gloucester, the first Earl of Hereford, marched east from Wallingford to attack the king's rear guard, thus requiring the abandonment of Stephen's campaign so as to protect the capital. At the same time, Nigel, the Bishop of Ely, rebelled against the king and attempted to conquer East Anglia, Stephen responding rapidly to this move by quickly putting down the rebellion through an assault and capture of Ely, Nigel being forced to retreat to Gloucester, where he took sides with the Empress Maud. Proposals were then put forward for a peace treaty between the two sides to be negotiated by Stephen's brother Henry, which quickly collapsed due to the insistence of the latter that he and the clergy should set the terms of the peace deal, to which Stephen found unacceptable. Furthermore, in his attempt to secure peace with Scotland, Stephen had inadvertently alienated the loyalty of Ranulph, Earl of Chester, who considered himself to hold the traditional rights to Carlisle in Cumberland, which meant he took great insult at the ceding of these lands to King David as part of the earlier peace treaty. Rumours quickly began to circulate that Ranulph planned to assassinate Henry while he travelled back from Stephen's court to Scotland after Christmas, thus prompting the king to guard his brother personally. Taking this distrust as a final act of offence, Ranulph, under the guise of a social visit, was invited to Lincoln Castle, whereupon he promptly seized the keep and claimed his own rights to the fortress, Stephen initially responding with a truce, to ensure that the Earl would not take the side of the Empress in the wider civil war, allowing him to keep the castle. Believing himself secure, Ranulph held Lincoln with a minimal force, but once this had been made apparent to Stephen, he reneged on the truce and marched his army north with all dispatch to retake the fort, only to find Ranulph had escaped and taken sides with the Empress. Lincoln was therefore besieged, while Ranulph, together with Robert of Gloucester, gathered an army and prepared to move against Stephen outside Lincoln during early 1141. On February 2nd, the two forces did battle, Stephen initially seeing success in repelling the attackers and fought with his men in the field against the rebels, though soon afterwards the situation turned sour for the monarch, and when he was nearly encircled by Robert and Ranulph's army, his supporters, including Welleran de Beaumont and William of Ypres, fled the battlefield, Stephen fighting on with his sword until it broke, and then with a borrowed battle-axe until he was eventually overwhelmed and captured. With the king now in Robert's hands, he was taken to Gloucester to meet his cousin, the Empress, before being imprisoned in Bristol Castle, Maud now undertaking preparations to have herself crowned queen, which would require the agreement of the church and her coronation at Westminster Abbey. Stephen's brother, Henry, therefore summoned a council at Winchester before Easter, and used his capacity as papal legate to consider the clergy's view, Henry having secretly made a deal with the Empress previously to deliver the support of the church in exchange for him being granted exclusive control over the affairs of the clergy in England. As a show of good faith, he handed over the largely depleted treasury to Maud, and excommunicated those subjects who refused to take an oath of fealty to the upcoming queen. In June 1141, the Empress advanced to London prior to her coronation, though despite having Stephen in captivity and with the Civil War won, she still did not have universal control over the nobility of England. This was clearly illustrated by the fact that while Geoffrey de Mandeville, governor of the Tower of London, was a loyal supporter of the Empress, other garrisons in the city remained faithful to Stephen, while the wider population of London was also hostile towards Maud. On June 24th, only days from the planned coronation, a violent uprising in the city took place that forced the Empress and Geoffrey de Mandeville out of London, her overall victory therefore being crushed before it could be secured, and she retreated frantically back to Oxford. This rejection by the populace of London spelled the beginning of the end for the Empress's campaign to retake the throne, all while Geoffrey of Anjou invaded Normandy again, and in the absence of Welleran de Beaumont, who was still fighting in England, he took over all the duchy south of the River Seine. Stephen's brother, Theobald, made no attempt to mount a defence, as during this time he was undertaking fractious negotiations with King Louis VII of France regarding his father's regional alliance, which would result in war the following year. As a result of Geoffrey's successful occupation of Normandy, the Anglo-Norman barons began to give up on Stephen's cause and take the side of the Empress, fearing that their lands and titles would be forfeit should Maud rise to the throne. Meanwhile, those supporters who had been displaced by Stephen's campaign against the rebels were reinstated to their positions, as was the case with Nigel, Bishop of Ely, who was restored to his post and given new earldoms. By mid-1141, Stephen's wife, also named Matilda, was the only one holding his faction together during his captivity, rallying his remaining lieutenants in the southeast of England and advancing into London following the Empress's humiliating rejection by the local population. At the same time, she also retained the loyalty of many high-ranking nobles, including Stephen's brother Henry, who defected back to the king's side, following his inability to reach a settlement on his role as leader of the clergy under the potential rule of the Empress. With this defection, the Empress, following her retreat from London, besieged his stronghold in Winchester, prompting the response of Queen Matilda, who in July 1141 was able to successfully rout the rebel forces during a decisive battle that saw the Empress put to flight and Robert of Gloucester captured. Now, with the military leadership of both sides in captivity, negotiations were made to agree a long-term peace settlement, though neither were willing to compromise on the future of the nation, and thus the situation was resolved through a simple prisoner exchange at Oxford in November 1141, with Stephen returned to his queen and Robert back to the Empress. Stephen was subsequently recrowned at Christmas, though afterwards he suffered an illness during the spring of 1142, in which rumours spread that the monarch had died, but he eventually recovered and began a new campaign against the rebels. The summer of 1142 was spent attacking some of the newly constructed rebel castles in Cirencester, Bampton and Wareham, while towards the end of the summer, Robert travelled to Normandy in order to assist Geoffrey in mopping up the last of Stephen's loyal barons in the region. With the military leadership of the rebel faction now out of the country, Stephen launched a daring attack on the fortified city of Oxford, where the Empress was residing, crossing the fast-flowing Thames, the depth of which required swimming part of the way, and breaking into the town before laying siege to Oxford Castle, trapping the Empress inside and cutting off all means of supply, the fort refusing to surrender while their leader was still present. This siege would last until December, at which point the Empress herself also made a daring escape across the Thames by sneaking on foot across the ice-covered river and through the ranks of Stephen's army, before disappearing into the night, travelling to the safety of Wallingford, the garrison of Oxford Castle laying down their arms the following day. 1143 began with more campaigning by Stephen against the rebels, and at one point came close to being captured again during the Battle of Wilton, where in an attempt to break a siege being made by Robert of Gloucester, his escape route was blocked by rebel cavalry that nearly saw him encircled and taken. However, thanks to the exceptional efforts of Stephen's steward, William Martel, a strong rear guard was able to keep a route of escape open to the king, who subsequently departed the battlefield, Martel being ultimately captured, though in order to ransom his loyal subject, Stephen was willing to exchange his steward for Sherborne Castle, one of the few instances where the monarch gave up a keep in exchange for one of his men. By the end of the year, a new threat arose in the form of Geoffrey de Mondeville, the Earl of Essex, who, following his earlier imprisonment by the king, rose up in rebellion against Stephen, vowing to retake his various castles, including the Tower of London, that was given to the king in exchange for his life. Raising an army in Ely and marching on Cambridge, he intended to eventually take London, but Stephen was preoccupied with other matters, including a revolt by Hugh Bigod in Norfolk, and thus instead of tracking down the rebels in the fens, he chose simply to build more fortifications between Ely and London, including Burwell Castle. Moving into 1144, the situation continued to worsen for the king, as Ranulph of Chester once again rose up in rebellion against him, while at the same time Robert of Gloucester and his followers continued to raid the surrounding royalist territories from their stronghold in the west of England, and the rebels in Wallingford Castle continued to actively threaten London. In Normandy, Geoffrey of Anjou finally rooted out the last of Stephen's loyalists, and in January 1144 took the capital of Rouen, whereupon King Louis VII of France recognised him as Duke of Normandy, the situation for Stephen, at this point, being perhaps the most desperate after his capture during 1141. However, the complexion of the war would gradually turn back in his favour, as various players were removed from the conflict, Miles of Gloucester, a primary commander of the rebel faction, being killed in a hunting accident during Christmas 1143, while Geoffrey de Mondeville's rebellion was crushed in September 1144 during an attack on Burwell Castle, where Geoffrey himself was killed. In 1145, Farringdon Castle in Oxfordshire was recaptured, and a fresh agreement with Ranulph of Chester was made that brought an end to his revolt in the north, Stephen inviting Ranulph to court before arresting him and threatening him with death in exchange for his castles, including Lincoln and Coventry. Though the exchange was made, Ranulph once again rose up in revolt upon his release, though having been stripped of his main fortifications, he had not the resources to mount a sustained campaign against the king, while Stephen had not the forces in northern England to crush the rebels, these tactics by Stephen only serving to sow deep distrust among his nobles. By 1146, hostilities within the wider conflict had essentially come to an end as both sides settled into a stalemate, Robert of Gloucester dying in 1147 of natural causes, while in 1148, in order to resolve a dispute with the clergy, the Empress gave up her stronghold of Devizes and returned to Normandy, her departure from England cooling the tensions of the Civil War. Further reducing the confrontation was the announcement of the Second Crusade by Pope Eugene III in 1145, at which point many honour-bound barons and knights departed the region in order to fight for Christendom, those who remained seeking individual peace agreements with each other in order to secure their lands and war gains. The only major incident was a small mercenary invasion by Geoffrey and Maud's son, the future King Henry II, during 1147, though this failed due to a lack of funds to pay his men. In 1149, Henry again attempted to reignite the war by encouraging Ranulph to form an alliance with him and mount another campaign against Stephen, though upon hearing of this proposal, the monarch marched north with an army that quickly dispelled Henry's planned revolt, and the young noble returned to France, whereupon he was declared Duke of Normandy by his father. However, while his attempts to unseat Stephen had proven unsuccessful, Henry's energetic vigour and capable leadership illustrated that he had many distinct qualities that would make for a strong king in the future. This was reinforced by his sudden marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, the recently divorced wife of King Louis VII, and one who held large swathes of territory across western and southern France. For Stephen, the matter of succession was an important issue, his own son, Eustace, being the preferred option, and it was hoped that the young prince could be crowned while Stephen was still alive, as per the custom in France, although this option was not universally accepted in England. Meanwhile, Archbishop Theobald, predicting yet more civil unrest should Eustace be crowned, refused to perform the coronation ceremony without agreement from the current Pope, Eugene III. This matter came to a head in Easter 1152, when following the refusal of both Theobald and his bishops to crown Eustace when pressed again, Stephen had all of them imprisoned, though the archbishop was able to escape and took up exile in Flanders, while Stephen's relationship with the church became severely strained. In 1153, Henry returned with another army and formed an alliance with Ranulph of Chester and Hugh Bigod, initially attacking Stephen's castle at Malmesbury, Henry knowing that he could not fight Stephen in pitched battle, and instead opted for a guerrilla campaign using surgical strikes against the king's army, while Stephen tried to coax Henry out into open conflict. Following a brief truce, Henry was able to persuade Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, to his side, which resulted in Henry controlling the southwest, the Midlands, and much of northern England. In July 1153, as Stephen attempted to finally destroy the rebel faction at Wallingford Castle, Henry marched south and met the king's army on the banks of the River Thames, though by this point, with the barons on both sides now tired of the civil war, after a prolonged period of peace, and unwilling to see more Anglo-Norman blood spilled in what would be an extremely costly battle, instead left it up to the clergy to broker a truce. While both Stephen and Henry were furious at the church's intervention, they too met privately to consider a permanent peace, which outraged Prince Eustace, and he tried to raise another army in Cambridge to march against the rebels, but within a month the young heir had died from a brief illness. With Eustace, the most obvious claimant to the English throne, now dead, this proved to be a politically convenient situation for those seeking a line of succession that could satisfy both parties. Finally, in November 1153, Stephen and Henry met at Winchester in order to agree the terms of a permanent peace, with Stephen declaring that Henry would be his adopted son and heir, in return for Henry's fealty, the terms of the agreement allowing Stephen to retain his royal powers, but would be open to Henry's advice. Stephen's second son, William, would also pay homage to Henry, and key royal castles would be held on Henry's behalf, while Stephen would have access to all of them, the peace treaty being sealed in Winchester Cathedral, and thus brought an end to the anarchy. However, although the war was over, hostility and brewing resentment resulted in an uneasy peace, with rumours circulating that William planned to have Henry assassinated, while in order to quell any distrust of the war's resolution, Stephen toured the country issuing royal writs and holding court in order to confirm among the barons that the monarch's authority had been returned after so many years of lawlessness. Eventually, Stephen, after a stomach disorder, died on October 25, 1154, and Henry returned to England, where he was crowned King Henry II on December 8th, the new king seeking to undo much of the distrust and damage caused by Stephen's reign due to his usurpation of the throne, and sought to listen to the advice and counsel of others. Most of his early reign, though, would be spent trying to repair the devastation of his country after over a decade of fighting, refill the royal treasury that had been depleted by the costs of Stephen's campaign against the rebels, and assuage the deep mistrust felt within his country after over a decade of fighting. More crucially, though, was that the upheaval caused by the Anarchy had allowed both the Scots and the Welsh to occupy disputed lands along their respective borders, while Stephen and his royal court had been distracted with the rebels, Henry seeking to reverse this, and in 1157 would pressure the young King Malcolm IV of Scotland to return the lands in northern England, while in 1158 saw two campaigns against the Welsh that eventually saw the border return to its pre-Civil War state. Ultimately, the outcomes of the Anarchy were that years of infighting between various Norman barons and nobles regarding the succession of the English throne were finally put to rest, Stephen's usurpation of the crown highlighting the fragile state of the newly conquered kingdom. It was in this, therefore, that action had to be taken to ensure that the future of England would not be decided through vying powers and warlords in a perpetual state of rebellion, with Stephen's eventual wisdom in allowing his cousin's son to rise to the throne, finally putting an end to the dispute and deciding the fate of British history going forward.